My husband demanded a divorce at my 80th birthday. Our children were crying. My lawyer shouted, "Fight for every cent!" But I calmly pulled out an envelope I'd kept for 30 years. He forgot one detail. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Mae Caldwell, and I turned 80 years old on a Tuesday in September. The maple tree in our front yard had already begun to turn, that deep, burning red I always loved. And my daughter Karen had driven 3 hours from Cincinnati to bake my favorite lemon cake. My son Robert flew in from Portland with his wife Linda and their 2 teenage boys. The house smelled of sugar and coffee and the particular warmth that only comes when a family fills a home. I had no reason to suspect that by the time the candles were blown out, my life as I knew it would be over. Richard and I had been married for 52 years. We met at a church social in 1970 in Columbus, Ohio, when I was 27 and he was 31. He had dark hair and broad shoulders, and a way of tilting his head when he listened to you that made you feel like the most important person in the room. We built everything together. The hardware store on Elm Street that he ran for 30 years, the colonial house on Birchwood Drive, the family, the savings, the quiet routine of 2 people who had grown so accustomed to each other that they sometimes finished each other's sentences without noticing. Were there signs? Looking back now, of course there were. There are always signs. I had simply chosen, as women of my generation were taught to do, not to see them. It started, I suppose, about 2 years before the birthday. Richard began coming home late on Thursdays. He said it was a poker night he'd joined with some men from the golf club. I didn't question it. Why would I? He was 73 years old and had earned his Thursday evenings. Then came the new phone. He said his old one was too slow, which struck me as odd, since he'd never cared much about technology. He kept it face down on the kitchen table, which I noticed but told myself meant nothing. He started showering as soon as he came in from those Thursday evenings, before dinner, before sitting down, before even saying hello properly. I mentioned it once, lightly, the way you mention something you're not sure you have the right to mention. You seem tired lately, Richard. He looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses and said, "I'm 73, Dorothy. Tired is what I am." And that was the end of it. Then came the birthday. Karen had set the dining room table with the good china, the ivory set with the gold rim that we'd received as a wedding gift and had used maybe 40 times in 52 years. Robert had opened a bottle of champagne. The boys were on their best behavior, sitting straight, wearing collared shirts. The cake sat in the center of the table, 8 small candles arranged in a circle because Karen thought 80 individual candles would be a fire hazard, and she was probably right. I sat at the head of the table, in what had always been my chair. Richard sat at the other end, in his. He had been quiet all evening, quieter than usual, and I had noticed, but assumed it was one of his moods, the kind that passed by morning. We sang. I blew out the candles. Everyone clapped. Karen began cutting the cake, and then Richard stood up. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't look at the children first, or at me with any particular expression. He simply stood up from his chair, slowly, because his knees had bothered him for years, and said, in the same even voice he used to read grocery lists, "Dorothy, I want a divorce. I've spoken to a lawyer. The papers are being prepared." The room went absolutely silent. Karen's knife stopped mid-cut. Robert set down his champagne glass. Linda pressed her hand over her mouth. The boys looked at the table. And I sat very still and felt something shift inside me, like a piece of furniture being moved in a dark room, not falling, just moved. "Richard," Robert said, his voice low and careful. "What are you talking about?" Richard didn't answer him. He was looking at me. His face was composed, almost clinical, the face of a man who had rehearsed this moment and was now executing it on schedule. Karen began to cry first, then Linda. Robert stood up from his chair, his jaw set in the way that meant he was furious but trying to contain it. The boys looked terrified, and I sat at the head of my birthday table in front of my lemon cake with its 8 small candles still trailing thin ribbons of smoke, and I thought very clearly. He has been planning this for a long time. That thought, not grief, not panic, but that cold, precise thought, was the first indication that I was not going to be destroyed by this. Not yet. Not entirely. But I didn't know that yet. What I knew in that moment was only that something had been done to me, deliberately, on this particular day, at this particular table, in front of my children and my grandchildren. And I thought, why today? What does he need me to be right now, in this moment? He needed me to be shattered. He needed me to be an old woman who had just been told her life was over, who would sign whatever was put in front of her because she was too broken to read it carefully. I looked at Richard across the table. He looked back at me, and I did not cry. The children stayed for 2 more days. Richard moved into the guest room that first night without discussion, without drama, without even the dignity of an argument. He simply carried his pillow down the hall and closed the door. I lay in our bed, my bed, I reminded myself, and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around me the way old houses do, creaking and sighing, as if they too were tired. Karen came to me the next morning before breakfast. She sat on the edge of the bed and took my hand and said, "Mom, you don't have to be strong right now." And I appreciated that. I understood what she was offering, but I also knew that if I allowed myself to fall apart, I would lose precious days I could not afford to lose. Because in the hours after Richard's announcement, while everyone else was crying or arguing or trying to mediate, I had been thinking, 52 years of marriage. One house, paid off in 1998, valued now at approximately $480,000, based on the neighborhood sales I'd been casually watching for years. A retirement account in both our names that I knew contained, as of last spring's statement, just over $900,000. Richard's pension from the hardware store co-op, our joint savings account, the lake cottage in Michigan that we had bought in 1994 for $60,000, and which I suspected was now worth considerably more. Half of all this was mine by law. I knew that. What I didn't know, what I needed to find out, was whether any of it had already been moved. That was the fear that kept me awake on my 81st night on Earth. Not the humiliation, not the loneliness, not even the question of who she was, though I already suspected there was a she. The fear was financial. The fear was that Richard, who had always handled our accounts, who had always been the one to speak with the accountant and the financial advisor, had spent the past months, or longer, quietly repositioning assets. Robert, before he left, had sat across from me at the kitchen table and slid a business card toward me. "His name is Gerald Marsh," Robert said. "He's a divorce attorney. Karen and I spoke to him this morning. He said you need to call him immediately." I looked at the card. Then I said, "I'll find my own attorney, Robert." He started to argue. I looked at him the way mothers look at their sons when the conversation is finished. He stopped arguing. The attorney I called was not Gerald Marsh. Her name was Patricia Hensley, and I had known her for 11 years through my church's women's group. Patricia was 64, sharp, small, with wire-rimmed glasses, and the particular patience of someone who had spent decades watching people underestimate her. I called her on a Thursday morning, 4 days after my birthday, from the back porch where Richard could not hear me. "Dorothy," she said, when I explained the situation, "how soon can you come in?" "Tomorrow," I said. Patricia's office was on the third floor of a brick building on Harrison Street, downtown Columbus. The waiting room smelled of old paper and good coffee. I sat in a leather chair across from her desk and told her everything I knew about our finances. She listened without interrupting. Then she leaned forward and said, "The first thing we need to do is freeze. Before he moves another dollar, we need a court order." "Can we do that?" "We can file for a temporary restraining order on the marital assets," she said. "It won't be immediate, but it will be faster than he's expecting." She paused. "Dorothy, I need to ask you something. Is there anything, any document, any record, anything you've held on to over the years that might be relevant here?" I thought about the envelope. I had thought about it, in fact, on and off for 30 years. It was in a shoebox on the top shelf of my bedroom closet, behind a stack of old Christmas cards. I had put it there in 1994 and told myself I hoped I would never need it. I had been right for a long time, and then I had been wrong. "There might be," I said. Patricia looked at me steadily. "Bring it," she said. On the drive home, I stopped at the grocery store. I bought bread and soup and a small bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums that I put in the blue vase on the kitchen windowsill. Richard was watching the news in the living room when I came in. He didn't look up. I put the groceries away, trimmed the chrysanthemum stems, and then went upstairs to my closet. I stood on the step stool and reached behind the Christmas cards and took down the shoebox. I sat on the edge of the bed with it in my lap for a moment. Then I opened it. The envelope was still there, sealed, exactly as I had left it. My handwriting on the front, in pencil, faded now. "Do not open unless necessary." I held it for a long time. Then I placed it carefully in my handbag. Was I afraid? Yes. I was 80 years old, and I was frightened in a way I hadn't been since the children were young and the world felt genuinely dangerous. But fear, I had learned over 8 decades, is only useful if you let it move you forward rather than backward. I had a plan. It was not yet complete, but it had begun. Patricia filed for the temporary restraining order on a Monday. By Wednesday morning, Richard knew about it. I was in the kitchen making tea when he came downstairs earlier than usual, still in his robe, his face set in an expression I recognized from 30 years of marriage. The controlled anger of a man who believes he has been surprised when he had no right to be surprised. "You hired a lawyer," he said. "I did," I said. "Patricia Hensley." "That's right." He stood in the doorway for a moment, studying me. There was something new in his eyes. A recalibration, I thought. A reassessment of what he was dealing with. He had expected, I realized, the other version of me. The version that cried at the birthday table and signed whatever was placed in front of her. "Dorothy," he said, in the measured tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. "We can do this civilly. There's no need for—" "Restraining orders?" I said pleasantly. Patricia thought there was. He left the kitchen without finishing his sentence. 10 minutes later, I heard him on the phone in the guest room, speaking in a low, urgent voice. I could not make out the words. I didn't need to. Patricia had done more than file the restraining order. In our second meeting, she had referred me to a forensic accountant named David Cho, a quiet man in his 40s who specialized in marital asset cases. I met him in his office on Broad Street, a practical, windowless room full of filing cabinets, and handed him the past 3 years of financial statements I had gathered from our shared accounts. He spent 40 minutes looking through them while I sat across from him and waited. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said finally, "do you know what a QTIP trust is?" I said I did not. He explained it to me carefully. A qualified terminable interest property trust, a legal structure sometimes used in estate planning and sometimes used, he said, with careful neutrality, as a vehicle for separating assets in anticipation of a divorce. Someone created one, in your joint names, approximately 14 months ago, he said. I'll need more documents to fully map this, but preliminarily, I can tell you that a significant portion of the retirement account appears to have been restructured through it. 14 months. I sat with that number. 14 months ago, Richard had still been bringing me coffee in the mornings. 14 months ago, we had spent a weekend at the lake cottage with the grandchildren. How significant? I asked. David Cho chose his words with care. Potentially $300,000. I looked at the wall behind his head for a moment. Then I said, "What do we need to prove it?" "Records," he said. "Bank transfers. The trust documents themselves. Possibly testimony from the financial advisor who set it up." And this was where the envelope became relevant. I had not shown it to Patricia yet. I had wanted to understand more first, to be certain I was reading the situation correctly. But that afternoon, sitting in David Cho's windowless office, I understood that the time for caution was past. The envelope contained a letter. Not from Richard. From a woman named Sandra Elliott, who had been Richard's bookkeeper at the hardware store from 1988 to 1996. In the summer of 1994, I had found a series of entries in our business checkbook that didn't correspond to any invoice I could locate. Small amounts, 200 here, 300 there, but consistent over 18 months. I had said nothing to Richard. Instead, I had spoken privately to our accountant at the time, a retired man named Harold Briggs, who I trusted absolutely, and Harold had told me gently that the payments appeared to be personal in nature and that I might want to document them. I had asked him to write it down. He had. That letter in Harold's neat handwriting detailed the discrepancies, the pattern, and his professional opinion that the funds had been used for personal expenditures outside the marriage. I had sealed it and put it away and never spoken of it. Richard had let Sandra go in 1996, and the payments had stopped, and I had told myself it was over. But Harold's letter established something important. A pattern. A history of Richard using marital funds for undisclosed personal purposes. In a divorce proceeding, that history was relevant. It went to the question of credibility. It went to the question of whether Richard Caldwell was the reasonable, transparent husband his attorney would inevitably try to present him as. When I showed Patricia the envelope, she read Harold's letter twice. Then she set it on her desk and looked at me over her glasses. "Dorothy," she said, "how long have you had this?" 30 years, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, to her credit, she smiled. "Good," she said. I drove home in the October dusk, the maples now almost entirely red, and I felt, for the first time since my birthday, something that was not quite hope, but was its functional equivalent. The clear, steady conviction that I was not going to lose. Had Richard ever imagined, in all his planning, that I had been quietly keeping records of my own? I doubted it, and that was his first real mistake. Patricia moved quickly after I showed her the envelope. Within the week, she had combined Harold Briggs's 30-year-old letter with David Cho's preliminary findings into a formal discovery request. The request compelled Richard's attorney, a man named Victor Sloan, whom I'd never met but had already formed an impression of from the way Patricia said his name, to produce the complete records of the QTIP Trust, the retirement account restructuring, and all financial transactions over the past 3 years. It also formally placed Harold's letter into the evidentiary record, establishing the pattern of financial concealment. Victor Sloan's response came 4 days later, in the form of a phone call to Patricia that she relayed to me with characteristic brevity. "He's rattled," she said. I was in her office when she told me this, sitting in the leather chair across from her desk, and I remember thinking that rattled was a word I'd never expected to hear applied to Richard, who had been, in 52 years, almost constitutionally unrattleable. It told me something important. He had not anticipated the QTIP trust being discovered so quickly. He had believed he had more time. The threat came on a Thursday evening. Of course it was a Thursday. I was at home, alone, eating soup at the kitchen table and reading, when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find not Richard, who had by then moved to what I gathered was a furnished apartment near the university, but his younger brother, Frank, and Frank's wife, Connie. Frank was 70 years old, barrel-chested, with a contractor's handshake and the blunt affect of a man who had never once in his life been required to be subtle. Connie stood slightly behind him, arms crossed, in the way of a woman who has been briefed. "Dorothy," Frank said, "can we come in?" I let them in because refusing would have given them something to use, a narrative of my being unreasonable, hostile, uncooperative. We sat in the living room. I offered tea. Connie declined. Frank declined. "Look," Frank said, leaning forward in the armchair that had been Richard's for 20 years. "You don't want to do this. You're making this ugly when it doesn't have to be ugly." "Richard made it ugly," I said mildly, "on my birthday." Frank's jaw tightened. "He's willing to be fair. But if you keep pushing with this lawyer and these accountants, you need to understand. He'll push back. He has documentation, too, about your spending, the trips you took with your church group, the renovation of the sunroom in 2019. He'll argue dissipation of marital assets." I looked at Frank for a moment. The sunroom renovation had cost $22,000, which we had paid for jointly from our savings account, with Richard's full knowledge and agreement. The church group trips had cost, in total, perhaps $8,000 over 5 years, and I had paid for them from my personal account. Neither of these things constituted dissipation of marital assets under Ohio law. Patricia had told me so, preemptively, because she was thorough. "Tell Richard to have his attorney call my attorney," I said. Connie spoke for the first time. "Dorothy, be realistic. You're 80 years old. This process is exhausting and expensive. Do you really want to spend the last years of your life in litigation?" There it was. The last years of your life. I noticed the phrase. I filed it. "I want what is mine," I said. "That's all. It's a simple goal." Frank stood up. His face had gone red in the way I remembered from a family Christmas argument in 2003. "You're going to regret pushing this," he said. It was not quite a threat. It was meant to sound like advice. After they left, I called Patricia and told her what had happened. She told me to write down everything they'd said, with times and details, which I did, at the kitchen table, in my good handwriting, on a legal pad. Then she said, calmly, "They just told us he's scared. That's useful." Victor Sloan filed a counter motion 10 days later, citing exactly the items Frank had named, the sunroom, the church trips, as evidence of wasteful spending. Patricia dispatched it within a week with receipts and the original written agreement Richard had signed for the sunroom work. Both were already in my files. That had always been my habit. I kept everything. It was not, in the years I did it, a strategy. It was simply how I was. But habits, I had learned, have a way of becoming exactly what you need. After the counter motion was dispatched, Patricia told me I had done well and that I should rest. "Take a few days," she said. "Don't talk to Frank or Connie or anyone connected to Richard without me present. Eat well. Sleep." I went to Karen's house for 4 days. I slept in her guest room, with its yellow curtains and the sound of my grandchildren's feet on the floor above me each morning. I ate her food and watched her television and walked her neighborhood in the October afternoons, breathing air that smelled of leaves and coming cold. I did not think about Richard if I could help it. I thought about what came next. Was I tired? Exhausted, in the way that goes past the body into something deeper. But I was also, underneath the exhaustion, more certain than I had been in months. The plan was working. The ground was solid. And I had not yet played my strongest card. Richard called me himself for the first time since the birthday on a Thursday in late October, while I was still at Karen's house. It was 7 in the evening. Karen was putting the boys to bed. I was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea, looking out at her backyard where the last of the season's tomato cages stood like small gray skeletons in the dusk. When his name appeared on my phone screen, I felt nothing in particular. That surprised me. I had expected something. A jolt of anger, a pang of grief, even the old conditioned warmth that 52 years installs in you like furniture. Instead, there was simply a flatness, like a room with the sound turned off. I answered, "Dorothy." His voice was the same. Of course it was the same. Voices don't change because people do. "I'd like to talk. Without the lawyers." "There's nothing to talk about without the lawyers," I said. "I think you're being—" He paused, selected his word carefully, the way he always did when he was managing his temper. "Rigid." "I'm being appropriate," I said. There was a silence. Then he shifted. I could hear it. A change of register. The softening he deployed when he wanted something. "Dorothy, we have grandchildren. We have a family. I made mistakes. I know that. But we can still resolve this in a way that—" "Richard," I said, "I will speak with you through Patricia Hensley. That's the appropriate process and we will follow it." And I ended the call. I sat for a moment looking at the phone on the kitchen table. Karen appeared in the doorway, having heard my voice, and looked at me with the expression of a woman bracing for damage. "Was that Dad?" "Yes," I said. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said. And I was. That was the surprising thing. The call that I had, on some level, been dreading for weeks had happened, and it had moved nothing in me. Whatever he had hoped to find in my voice, doubt, wavering, an opening, he had not found it. I had spent 52 years learning how Richard Caldwell persuaded people. I was, perhaps, the single worst candidate on earth to be persuaded by him. But I was not unaware that the isolation of a legal process could become its own kind of vulnerability. Patricia had warned me about this. "The process is long," she had said, "and it will try to wear you down. Make sure you have people around you who are not part of the case." I thought about who those people were. There was my friend Eleanor, who I had known since our children were in middle school together, and who had been through her own divorce at 61. A difficult, expensive, ultimately successful divorce. And who had, since my birthday, called me every third day without fail. There was my church group, 8 women between the ages of 65 and 82, who met on Wednesday mornings and who had, in the weeks since my birthday, demonstrated the particular solidarity of women who have seen everything and are surprised by nothing. And there was, unexpectedly, my neighbor Judith, who was 68 and a retired social worker, and who had knocked on my door one Saturday morning with a casserole and the brisk practicality of someone who knew exactly what a woman in my position needed. I called Eleanor that Thursday evening, after Richard's call. We talked for an hour. She didn't offer advice unless I asked for it. She mostly listened and asked the right questions and said, at the right moments in the way of someone who has been paying complete attention. When I told her about Richard's call, she said simply, "Good. You did exactly right." And I believed her, not because she flattered me, but because she had been through it herself and knew what the right thing looked like. The Wednesday Women's Group became, in those weeks, something I relied on more than I would have predicted. We were not, as a group, given to emotional demonstrativeness. We were women of a certain generation and temperament who expressed care through action. Food brought, rides offered, company given. They did not ask me probing questions or push me toward feelings I wasn't ready to have. They simply included me, steadily, in the ongoing fabric of their ordinary lives. It was, I discovered, exactly what I needed. Judith came over twice a week. We walked the neighborhood together in the mornings, down Birchwood Drive and around the park and back, and she talked about her work, her children, her opinions about the city council and the new development on Chester Street. And I talked about whatever I felt like talking about, and sometimes we said very little, and it was still good. She didn't ask me about the case unless I brought it up. Richard's side was watching. I knew this because Frank had driven slowly past the house twice that I noticed, and because Karen called to tell me that Connie had reached out to her with an offer to mediate. Karen had declined on my behalf. Let them watch, I thought. There is nothing to see but an old woman living her life. That was, in fact, the most accurate description of my strategy in those weeks. Living my life. Steadily, carefully, with company and purpose, and the daily accumulation of small, ordinary things. I walked and cooked and went to church and had dinner with Eleanor and walked with Judith and attended my Wednesday group. I read the legal documents Patricia sent me and called her when I had questions and signed what needed to be signed. I was not performing calm. I was genuinely becoming it. And beneath the calm, the case was moving. The Sunday they came, it had just turned November. I had been home for 2 weeks by then, back in my own house, which I refused to cede to anyone, and the maple in the front yard had finally surrendered its last leaves, standing bare now against a white sky. I had made a pot of beef stew and was reading at the kitchen table when I heard the knock. It was Richard, and behind him, standing slightly to one side, in matching expressions of studied warmth, were Frank and Connie. I looked at them through the glass panel of the front door for a moment. Then I opened it. "Dorothy," Richard said. His tone was different from the phone call, softer, more careful, with something in it I recognized as the long-practiced imitation of tenderness. "I'm sorry to come without calling, but I needed to see you." I stepped back and let them in. Not out of weakness, out of the same calculation I had made when Frank and Connie had come before. Refusing entry was a gesture that could be used against me, and I was, by this point, interested in what they were going to say. We sat in the living room. Frank and Connie took the sofa. Richard sat in his old armchair. I sat across from them in the chair I had always considered mine, with my back straight and my hands folded in my lap, and I waited. Richard began with an apology. It was, I noted, a structural apology. "I know I hurt you, and I should have handled it differently." The kind that acknowledges impact without accepting responsibility. He said he had been going through something. He said he had not been thinking clearly. He said he valued everything we had built together and did not want to see it destroyed by a process that would only benefit the lawyers. I let him finish. Then Connie spoke. Her tone was warm in the way of someone who has rehearsed warmth. "Dorothy, we love you. You are family. And we are so worried about what this process is doing to you. The stress, the cost. Richard is willing to make a very fair settlement offer. Patricia Hensley doesn't need to be involved. We can sit down, all of us, and work this out in a way that is dignified and kind. I noticed several things simultaneously. I noticed that the settlement offer had materialized without any prior formal communication through the legal channels Patricia had established. I noticed that the offer was framed as Richard's generosity rather than my legal entitlement. I noticed that the proposed mechanism, sitting down all of us, was designed to put me in the position of a family member rather than a legal party, which was the position from which I was most vulnerable to pressure. "What is the offer?" I asked. Richard mentioned a number. It was approximately 40% of what David Cho had assessed as my rightful share of the marital assets, and it did not include the lake cottage or any portion of the QTIP trust funds. It was also presented as final, conditional on my withdrawing the discovery request and releasing Patricia Hensley. I sat with it for a moment. Did they imagine I had not done the math? "That's not an equitable offer," I said. Richard's face shifted, almost imperceptibly, but I had been reading his face for 52 years. The practiced softness slipped, just briefly, and underneath it was something harder and less patient. "Dorothy," he said, and the tone had changed now. "You need to think about what continued litigation means for this family. Karen and Robert are distressed. The grandchildren are confused. You are 80 years old, and this process will take years and thousands of dollars. I am offering you a clean, quick resolution." "You are offering me 40 cents on the dollar," I said pleasantly. "Patricia will explain why that's not acceptable." Frank leaned forward. He had been quiet throughout, but I could see he'd been holding it with effort. "Dorothy, I'm going to be straight with you because I've always been straight with you. You are playing a game you don't fully understand. Victor Sloan has resources and experience that—" "Frank," I said, "I am not playing a game. I am pursuing what is legally mine. Those are different things." The room went very quiet. Richard and Frank exchanged a look. Quick, involuntary. The look of two people recalibrating. Connie looked at her hands. Then Richard said, in a voice stripped now of all its manufactured softness, "You are going to regret this, Dorothy." It was, I noted, the second time a member of this family had used that phrase to me. I found it interesting. The repetition, the expectation that the word regret would function as a lever. As if I had not, in 80 years, already made my peace with regret as a permanent feature of a life fully lived. They left 20 minutes later. Frank shook his head at me as he went. Connie said nothing. Richard paused at the front door and looked back at me in the hallway, and for one moment his face was entirely unguarded, and I saw in it something that was not anger, but its more complicated cousin. A kind of surprise, or perhaps a recognition, that I was not who he had thought I was, or perhaps that I was exactly who I had always been, and he had simply never looked carefully enough to know it. After they were gone, I locked the front door and stood in the hallway for a moment. My heart was beating faster than usual. My hands, I noticed, were not steady. Was I frightened? Yes. Victor Sloan was, in fact, experienced. The process was, in fact, expensive and long and grinding, and I was, in fact, 80 years old. All the things they had said were true, and I was not so proud as to pretend otherwise. But the fear was clean. It was the fear of a person who knows exactly what they are risking and has decided the risk is worth taking. And underneath it, working its way through me the way warmth works its way through cold hands, was something that felt very much like certainty. I went back to the kitchen and called Patricia. Then I ate my stew. It was still warm. The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday in December, in a conference room on the 6th floor of a downtown office building. Patricia had prepared me for 3 weeks. We had gone through every document, every account statement, every entry in Harold Briggs's 30-year-old letter. We had reviewed David Cho's forensic report, which now ran to 41 pages and included a complete reconstruction of the QTIP trust transactions, the retirement account restructuring, and what David had identified as an additional transfer of funds to a personal account that had been opened in Richard's name alone in March of the previous year. 14 months, almost to the week before my 81st birthday. Victor Sloan was exactly as I had imagined. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the polished confidence of a man who had spent 30 years winning in rooms like this one. He sat across the long conference table with Richard beside him, and on Richard's other side, to my considerable surprise, sat a woman I had never seen before. She was perhaps 55. She was composed, well-dressed, and did not look at me. I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked at the table. Patricia opened by placing David Cho's report in front of Victor Sloan. Victor looked at it with the careful neutrality of a poker player examining a hand he hadn't expected. "Mr. Caldwell," Patricia began, her voice unhurried, "you have stated in previous filings that the QTIP trust was established for legitimate estate planning purposes. Is that correct?" Richard, through Victor, confirmed it. "And you would characterize the transfer of approximately $312,000 into this trust as a routine estate planning measure?" Victor interjected. "The transfer," he said, "was entirely legal, properly documented, and made with full compliance to applicable regulations." Patricia said. She opened a second folder. "Mr. Cho's analysis identifies that this trust names as its secondary beneficiary an individual who is not a member of the Caldwell family. Can you explain that?" The room was very quiet. Richard looked at Victor. Victor kept his eyes on the document. "The trust documents will speak for themselves," Victor said. "They will," Patricia agreed. She placed a copy of the trust documents on the table, copies she had obtained through the court-ordered discovery. She had highlighted a single line near the bottom of page 3. The secondary beneficiary was listed as a Margaret Diane Foster. Richard's personal account, the one David Cho had identified as opened 14 months before my birthday, received its first deposit 4 days after the trust was established. The deposit was from a joint savings account that Richard had sole signatory authority over. "Mr. Caldwell," Patricia said, "who is Margaret Foster?" Richard said nothing. He was looking at the documents with the expression of a man watching a controlled demolition. The particular stillness of someone who knows the building is coming down and has accepted it, but cannot quite bring himself to look away. Victor leaned over and spoke quietly into Richard's ear. Richard shook his head slightly. Victor straightened and said, in his most composed voice, "My client declines to answer questions about individuals not party to this proceeding." "That's his right," Patricia said. "Though I'll note for the record that Ms. Foster has already been identified in our filings and will be deposed separately." That was the moment. I watched Richard's composure fracture. Not dramatically, not with raised voices or visible distress, but in the small, precise way that a hairline crack moves through old porcelain. His jaw tightened. He looked for the first time like someone who had lost. But Patricia wasn't finished. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, and this was for me, "would you like to explain the relevance of the document in your possession?" I opened my handbag and removed the envelope. I had carried it to every meeting since October. I had held it in my hands 100 times. I placed it on the table and pushed it, carefully, to the center. "This letter," I said, "was written by Harold Briggs, a licensed CPA, in the summer of 1994. It documents a pattern of unauthorized personal expenditures from our joint business account over an 18-month period. Mr. Briggs identified the payments as personal in nature, unconnected to business expenses, and consistent in their pattern with expenditures made for the benefit of an individual outside the marriage. Victor picked up the letter. He read it. His face gave nothing away, but his hand, when he set the letter down, was fractionally less steady than it had been. This establishes, Patricia continued, addressing the record, a documented pattern of financial concealment extending over 3 decades. It goes directly to the question of Mr. Caldwell's credibility regarding his characterization of the QTIP trust as routine estate planning. Richard looked at me then, really looked at me. The first time, I thought, since the birthday dinner. His face was the face of a man who had built a careful structure and was watching it come apart, and who was trying to understand, still, where the flaw had been. Where the flaw was me. He had miscalculated me. He had seen what he expected to see: an elderly woman, a trusting wife, a birthday table. And he had seen it for so long that he had stopped checking whether it was accurate. "We have 4 more documents," Patricia said to Victor Sloan. "Would you like to proceed, or shall we schedule a continuation?" Victor looked at Richard. Richard was looking at the table. After a moment, Victor said, "We'll take a recess." They took the recess. I sat in my chair and looked out the window at the gray December sky over Columbus, and breathed in and breathed out, and thought about nothing in particular. Patricia sat beside me and did not speak. She didn't need to. When they came back from the recess, Victor Sloan's posture had changed. It was subtle, a slight settling, a repositioning of the shoulders that I recognized as the body language of a man revising his position. "My client," he said, "wishes to discuss the possibility of a revised settlement." "I'm listening," Patricia said. The revised settlement discussion took 3 weeks. Patricia called it negotiation, which was technically accurate. But what it felt like, from my side of the table, was less a negotiation than a gradual and complete concession. Richard's position, which had begun with the insulting offer Frank and Connie had presented in my living room, moved steadily toward what David Cho had identified as my full legal entitlement, and then, in certain respects, past it. The final agreement, which we signed in Patricia's office on a cold Wednesday in January, gave me the following: the house on Birchwood Drive, outright. Patricia had argued, successfully, that my contributions to the household over 52 years, including the unpaid labor of raising 2 children and managing the domestic infrastructure that had allowed Richard to build his business, constituted a substantial non-financial contribution to the marital estate. Ohio courts have recognized this. Victor Sloan knew it. He had not fought hard. Half of the retirement account in its entirety, including the funds that had been restructured through the QTIP trust. David Cho's documentation of the trust's secondary beneficiary and the irregular transfer pattern had made Victor's defense of that restructuring essentially untenable. The money came back into the marital estate and was divided equally. The Lake Cottage in Michigan. Richard had wanted it, had, in fact, listed it among his non-negotiables in the early stages. Patricia had pointed out that my name was on the deed, that I had driven to Michigan every summer for 30 years and managed the property's maintenance and rental calendar, and that the forensic accounting showed Richard had transferred rental income from the cottage into his personal account in the previous year, without my knowledge or consent. The cottage was mine, half of Richard's pension, calculated from the date of our marriage, and following additional discovery that Patricia had pursued after the deposition. The personal account Richard had opened in March of the prior year, the account that had received funds from our joint savings, was found to contain, after several months of what David Cho characterized as disbursements consistent with maintaining a secondary domestic arrangement, approximately $94,000. These funds were determined to be marital assets and were added to the settlement pool. Richard had retained Victor Sloan because Victor Sloan was experienced. He was. But experience is not the same as having the facts. Victor had done what he could with what he had and what he had. Once the QTIP trust was exposed, once Harold Briggs's letter was in the record, once the personal account was discovered, was not enough. The morning we signed, Patricia poured 2 small glasses of scotch from the bottle she kept in her bottom drawer for what she called significant occasions. We touched glasses. She said, "You were exceptionally prepared." I said, "I had 30 years to get ready." She laughed, which I think surprised her. Karen had come with me. She sat in the waiting room while we signed, and when I came out, she looked at my face and started crying. Not sad crying, the other kind, and held me for a long time. I held her back. I thought about the birthday table and the lemon cake and the 8 candles, and I thought about what it meant that a woman could stand in a moment like that one and still, somewhere very deep and very quiet, already be figuring out the next step. Robert called that afternoon from Portland. He asked how I felt. I told him I felt fine. He said, "Mom, you're extraordinary." I said, "I'm practical. There's a difference." He laughed too. That evening, I drove alone to the lake cottage in Michigan. I know that sounds impulsive. It was January. The roads were cold. The cottage was closed for the season. But I had wanted, since the deposition, to sit in that particular living room and look out at that particular lake and simply exist in a space that was mine. I unlocked the door and turned on the small lamp in the corner and sat in the old wingback chair near the window. The lake was gray and still under a low sky. The birches along the shore had lost all their leaves. It was very quiet. Was it what I had imagined? No. It was better. It was the specific, unglamorous, entirely real satisfaction of a thing done correctly. No dramatic music. No witnesses. Just me and the gray lake and the knowledge that what was mine had been protected and that I had protected it. I sat there for 2 hours. Then I drove back to Columbus. Spring came early to Columbus that year. The forsythia bloomed in March, and by April, the maple in my front yard had put out a full cover of green that made the house look freshly itself. I stood on the porch one morning with my coffee and looked at that tree for a long time. It had been there when Richard and I moved in 38 years ago. It had outlasted a great many things. I decided, looking at it, that I had something in common with it. I was adjusting to a different life. It wasn't Richard's presence I missed, so much as the shape his habits had given to the days. The way 50 years of routine takes up space you don't notice until it's gone. I relearned the rhythm of solitude. Cooking, for one. The freedom of the television remote. The slow realization that I had preferences I'd never fully articulated because there had always been someone else's to accommodate. Some mornings, I ate breakfast at 10 o'clock, simply because I wanted to. It sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. I did not waste much time grieving the marriage. I had done most of that grieving in the years before I knew I was doing it. In the Thursdays, he came home late, in the phone turned face down on the table. By the time the divorce was final, the grief was already old. I began attending a watercolor class on Tuesday evenings. I had painted briefly in my 30s and had missed it without fully knowing it. I was, for several weeks, the worst painter in the room, which I found unexpectedly enjoyable. Helen, the instructor, told me once that bad painters who keep showing up always improve faster than talented ones who stay home. I kept showing up. By December, my work was, if not good, at least recognizably intentional. Eleanor and I began taking a trip every spring. Savannah the first year, Santa Fe the second. "We have an embarrassing amount of time," she said. "We should use it." She was right. We walked slowly and ate well, and stayed in places with good beds, and talked the way women talk when there is no one to perform for. Those trips became, quickly, the thing I looked forward to most. I sold the lake cottage that fall for $340,000, 5 times what we'd paid in 1994. I gave a portion to Karen and Robert. The rest I invested. My church group continued its Wednesday mornings. Judith and I continued our walks. I discovered, a better grandmother than I'd been when I was also a wife. More present, less distracted by the management of a marriage that had quietly been costing me more than I knew. And Richard? He and Margaret Foster had moved in together, and it had not gone well. She was not the uncomplicated new beginning he had imagined. She had her own history, her own demands, her own sharp edges that his careful planning had apparently failed to account for. By the second year, the relationship had ended. He was living alone in a smaller apartment, his retirement considerably less comfortable than planned. Frank's construction business had been hit by a serious contract dispute that had drawn in lawyers and eaten through his savings. Their son was estranged from them, for reasons that had nothing to do with me, but that seemed consistent with the character I had observed in my living room that November evening. I did not take pleasure in any of it, but I noticed it with equanimity, the recognition that character is a long game, and that the calculations people make about what they can get away with are rarely as precise as they believe. I turned 82 in September. Karen baked the lemon cake again, 8 candles, exactly as before. I sat at the head of my table and blew them out, and everyone cheered. I thought briefly of the year before. The same table, the same cake, the different end of it. What had I carried into this one? 30 years of careful records, a letter from a retired accountant, and the quiet conviction that I was owed the truth and capable of standing in it. It had been, I decided, enough. What would you have done? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. Share this if it moved you, and thank you truly for listening.